Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to the fourth and final week of this year's Schooler Institute. This is a first for us to do Schooler online and to stretch it over a month. It's been a great time over the last 4 weeks. Many thanks to Nate Adams and Colleen Ogle for getting us started in week one. Grace and Matthew and Chris George we're up the second week, and then Tanika Shepard and Andy Call last week. It's been a rich conversation. I'm grateful for their presentations, for their interactions, and for all of you who are participating alongside us, putting your thinking, your ideas, your questions into this. It's been a good experience. I want to welcome our final two participants today, Kathy Dwyer, pastor of Rock Springs UCC in Arlington, Virginia, and Emanuel Cleaver III from St. James UMC in Kansas City. Kathy, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your ministry context.
Thanks for having me, Jay. It's great to be here. This is my 12th year at Rock Spring. We are located about 15 minutes from the White House. We are a progressive, vibrant faith community. And if I'm to overgeneralize, I think many of our members come to Rock Spring because they want to be engaged with social justice and want to also cultivate joy. The other large segment of our congregation spends their time in their day job and extra time trying to bring about justice or serve as public servants, or day in, day out trying to make the world a better place, and come to the congregation really wanting to refuel and remember why they're doing what they're doing. So it's an interesting dynamic to hold together. But there is a real strong commitment to social justice at Rock Spring. We are United Church of Christ. So for those of you who are Methodist, the polity is quite different. The congregation, we are very congregationally based in our decision making, in our sense of ministry, and that the congregation really are the ministers of the church and have the autonomy to make decisions about governance, about direction, about anything. So that's an interesting dynamic in a time when changes needs to happen so quickly. So a little bit about Rock Spring. We are a mid-size. We have 500 and some members, and it's really a privilege for me to serve this congregation. It feels like home from the moment I got here.
Thanks, Kathy. Emanuel.
Emanuel Cleaver III, St. James in Kansas City, Missouri. And St. James has 2 campuses. Our largest campus is in the inner city. We are actually the exact center of the Kansas City metropolitan area. And we have a South Campus. St. James is a community-oriented church, a lot of social justice ministries, a lot of, even outside of the ministries of St. James, people are involved in a number of different things throughout the city. A community church, feeding programs every week. Matter of fact, going on today. I am in June, I will complete year 14 as the senior pastor there. And I grew up at St. James, so I know the church very well. My father pastored there for 34 years. And we co-pastored for a year, but I served several other churches prior to coming back to St. James. So we have members from all over the city. On the Kansas side, if you're familiar with Kansas City, the metropolitan is on both sides of the state line, Kansas and Missouri. So yes, we have a lot of Jayhawk fans, and they are celebrating. the Jayhawks championship. We have about 700 of our members come from the Kansas side, and we have about 2,500 or so, a little more than 2,500 on the Missouri side. So just a little something about St. James.
Thank you. We've kind of been all over the map over the last 3 weeks. Some of it intentional, some of it our intentionality around not having a plan, trying to look at what could organically arise from the conversation, and trying to follow the leading of some of the questions. And it seems like we've been dealing both with very, very practical kinds of things, and then some deeper kinds of issues around values and theological underpinnings to what's going on. But I might just start us with a bit of a softball. Looking back, practically, assess how you did. We're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about exactly what happened that first day or the second day. We've talked a little bit in past weeks about the first Sunday. Many people were preaching from home. One of our past guests preached in front of an iPhone held by his 12-year-old. That was the tech available. We've talked a little bit about first time back in the sanctuary. One of our guests actually preached to teddy bears on the second Sunday back because she needed someone to look at. But I'm going to ask the two of you, how did you do?
Well, I'll say I think we did okay. We're still open, so I maybe that's a sign. Thankfully, we were already streaming online 5 years prior to the pandemic. So what we were doing was recording on Saturday. I'd go in and preach to an empty sanctuary on Saturday, and we'd stream it live or stream it on Sunday. It was a challenge because I come from a tradition, in the Black church tradition, where people sort of talk to you when you're preaching. So it was quiet, and it was a challenge preaching to nothing but silence in a 1,000-seat sanctuary. But I think over time, we were able to make some adjustments and spent that time actually updating all of our equipment so that we could be more efficient in streaming. So I think we did okay. Our budget never really dropped, so the giving remained the same. So we survived.
It's kind of fun to think back on the beginning. And I too, we were lucky. We were live streaming also for 5 or 6 years before the pandemic hit, but immediately started viewing the live streaming from a different perspective. Rather than just showing the service, we really drilled in on what the home viewers' experience was and ramped up our technology and our tools to create a more intimate experience. And I think that's one of the things that has been just a real gift in the process, is our not only developing the skills to do that, but being able to look at the experience of worship engagement from someone who's not in the sanctuary. We chose our team was live every Sunday. We didn't pre-record. And as a staff team, I felt like, I think the pandemic brought us much closer, because we were, as a team, every week, it felt like we were taking new risks and encouraging one another in it. I remember the first Easter, what our streaming provider said was the streaming provider was so overwhelmed with people engaging at the same time that there was a blip that that we weren't connecting as we were starting to go live on our, we'd never had that problem before. And I ran home that Easter morning next door, I live next door, got a little tripod in my iPhone, and I was about to just convert Easter morning to Facebook Live, and suddenly it all went on. But I mean, it was those experiences when you're experiencing them together as a staff and have these panic moments and are risking new things with the way you're doing things. I think it's made us stronger as a unit. So all of that's good. And I, with you, Emanuel, just am grateful that we had started it before the pandemic, because that would have been a really made the transition much more rough. I think the other thing that happened is many of our lay members really stepped up for caring for one another in new ways. And so we developed a different sense of community, not through the entire congregation, but more expansively. You know, we missed that opportunity on Sunday morning to see everybody in the sanctuary and kind of check in. And so as we tried to develop ways to connect, the pastors just wouldn't be possible for us to make all those connections. And so when the lay members of the congregation stepped in to do that, I think that added a sense of connection and depth of relationship for the congregation. We too have been lucky that people have continued to financially support the congregation. We've continued to receive new members, you know, so it has not been easy, but you know, I'm proud of our team, not only the staff team, but our lay leadership. Our council has just been so agile and forward-looking and supportive, that, you know, it's one of the reasons I'm grateful to serve here.
Have you found ways to measure this is not a fair question. I think we're all riding on anecdotes right now. There's not a lot of data. I think both of you said the finances held. That is one very tangible way of looking at how people have stayed connection. Are there other metrics? I'm wondering, Kathy, you have a sense that your people are engaged. How do we know that? I'm not questioning it, but how have you kept yourself feeling like you know what's happening with them for so long? At least in the circles I pastored in, worship attendance in the sanctuary was such an important barometer of activity level. And in fact, we probably made it too big a thing.
Absolutely.
What are your metrics now? What are you looking for?
And you're right, it's anecdotal. I mean, we certainly have our streaming stats that we see every week, and those are starting to go down as people come back. And so that's a little alarming, because you're trying to figure out what that means. But we have a full program. You know, we do so much online. We're involved in advocacy. We've made a commitment to, you know, our campus is becoming net zero, and that requires just engagement in our lay members to, you know, participate in all sorts of things outside of Sunday morning, even though it might be virtual. Like the number of people that are involved in our Faith and Democracy campaign and get out the vote postcards, and so people respond to those initiatives, things that we do outside of Sunday morning. And again, I mean, it's not metrics that I have on a grid, it's more of an energy. And the ongoing need to keep coordinating, and on top of all the people that want to be engaged in different ways in the life of the church, right? So that said, we have other areas that are struggling, like our choir. We could talk about choirs. That's, I think that's a super big challenge. How people want to engage is different. How people see membership, I think, is different. And just last week, I went through our entire database and created a file of, a checklist of dozens of names for which I'm not sure what their engagement is. That they were the people that would come to church on Sunday and may not be that engaged in the life of the church outside of Sunday morning. And maybe they're watching, maybe they're not, who knows? Because we haven't heard from them. So we're developing, a way to reach out.
Well, we do some of the same things. We use Vimeo as one of the streaming avenues we use. And so they provide analytics. And so we're able to see where people are joining us from. We had 42 states, people from 42 states and 11 countries. And it's been like that since the pandemic. So I'm trying to reach those other 8 states. I'm not sure what's going on with those 8 states. So we're using that. And we're also looking at, how many Facebook followers do we have? How many YouTube subscribers do we have? How many givers do we have? We're also keeping track of, our Bibles. We're still doing Bible study and Sunday school. We've done that throughout the pandemic, and our growth groups to track people's giving. And of course, since we never actually closed the doors at St. James because the kids, when the school shut down, those kids that were on free and reduced lunch still needed food. And so we provided food all throughout the pandemic for breakfast and lunch for kids. And so we checked, our volunteers, the number of people we had volunteering. And then we opened our doors for kids to use whose parents had to go to work and they needed access to the internet. And so we opened that. And so we're looking at volunteers for our outreach ministries and, Sunday school, Bible study, all of those things as a way of tracking, how people are still engaged. And so that's the best we've come up with so far.
I've worshiped in both of your congregations, in both of your churches, and there's a vibrancy in both places. You mentioned in one of your earlier comments, Emanuel, about when you first started preaching without the response. How are you doing just yourselves? Clearly you're keeping track of your congregation, and you both have really good stories to tell about that, and that is encouraging. How are you doing? So much of pastoral ministry is the relationship with people, and maybe we take ourselves too seriously as preachers, just assuming that that's what people. But this is the Schooler Institute on preaching. So I want to talk about you as people who preach. I know both of you well enough to know you're good preachers and you get affirmation for that. How are you doing without that constant? I'm not questioning whether your humility or anything like that. I'm not asking you to get into, oh yeah, I miss them applauding, but is the lack of contact, does it hurt? Does it help?
For me, it took some time. We actually, started recording in the sanctuary, but it's so big. So we moved around trying to make it more intimate, because it was, for me, a challenge to preach in such a large space that was empty. But, after, a few months, I think I adjusted. To me, I worked harder during the pandemic than it seems like ever in my ministry. And, to be honest, I'm ready for a sabbatical. It was a lot of work. And on top of that, I was doing more than pastoral ministry. So it was an extra drain teaching at St. Paul School of Theology, and actually wrote a book during the pandemic. Why'd I do that? I don't know. But it was very tiring. now that people are, so we have opened our doors for the sanctuary in last Easter when we opened up, and so we only allow I forgot the percentage, but we're not full capacity, so still most people are online, and I don't think even if we opened it up to everyone, I don't know that everyone would come back. I think a lot of people are used to worshiping online in their pajamas with some coffee on the treadmill or whatever. So that's something that we're learning to adapt to. How do we do ministry in this new era? Because I don't think that church will ever go back to how it was before. We're in a completely new era. So, I mean, overall, I think I'm surviving. My head is above water, but I'm ready for a sabbatical.
Do you have one coming?
I'm working on one with the Lilly Grant. I got to get all my paperwork in later this month. So hopefully.
April 27th.
Oh, you have the date. Yeah, that's right. So you're applying for it as well.
I couldn't pull it together, but
Okay.
yeah, anyway.
Okay.
It's been hard. And okay, this is connected to preaching, but I think I'm going to preface this. I think my role with the staff has changed in the pandemic. And because we've gotten much closer, and because we've encouraged risk-taking, I've found myself spending a lot more of my energy encouraging, supporting staff. And I'm happy about that, but it is a different dynamic than pre-COVID. Preaching, I had to kind of go through some mental gymnastics. We have a smaller sanctuary, and there's a little light above the camera, and I had to really train myself to imagine members of the congregation as that light, you know, and train myself to look straight into that camera because that's where the viewer was, as opposed to scanning the congregation like we always do. But I actually think, you know, I think I've really felt, and still today through this, when I can feel the gravity of the congregation, whatever feeling it is in the moment. And I think those feelings have changed since the beginning of the pandemic and now into Ukraine, et cetera. But when we're in those spaces where people are fearful or anxious or have lost hope, or suddenly there's several, you know, a number of people who are really sick and dying, in some ways, I find that I don't want this. It's easier to preach because it's so clear. I try to name those things, and the discipline of going to the ancient text and finding hope and encouragement in our scripture and trying to name that gives the sermon purpose. Right? It's not like, oh, here we are in Advent and we're supposed to be waiting for something. What are we waiting for? And let's look at the lectionary text. Instead, there feels like this urgency because everybody is looking for some message, whether it's from me or on a billboard, but or scrolling Facebook. But you sense this communal desire for a word of hope. And it's been hard, but it's also been meaningful, and it's felt purposeful. I guess it's felt purposeful because I don't remember a time in my life when when I've had a congregation or a community of people around me so desperate to hear something that gives them something to hold on to. And I don't know that I always do that. I don't know to the extent that I can do that, but at least it gives me focus, right?
Yeah, that you've taken a question about how you're doing individually and brought it back, both of you, to vocation. And so you're finding, I hear the weariness, and I think that's something that many of us are experiencing. I certainly hear it from pastors in a lot of places, but I'm also hearing about the depth. I asked last week, I opened with a question to our speakers. Church is different now. Would you do it again if you were entering into ministry? And I asked them to be gentle because we have some of our current students listening. But it sounds like while you're tired, you're finding some meaning. The first few weeks, it felt like churches I was watching, it was all adapting to just kind of this whole shift and dealing with just a lot of practical challenges. By the second or third month, what came up in some of our questions last week or the week before was it harder or easier to deal with the major issues? One of the things that happened shortly after the pandemic started, after the killing of George Floyd, and the confluence of living in a pandemic and wrestling in as broad a way as our society had for some time, I think, with matters of racial justice. And does the intensity of the way we were worshiping, the way we were preaching, I would have wondered at first whether some of that would be harder. But I think what I've experienced is there is an intimacy to the kind of online worship that allowed for some pretty clear communication.
One thing I forgot to mention, with the online worship is one thing that helped me when we were strictly online was I would take my iPad and phone up to the lectern so I could see the comments from people who are on YouTube and on Facebook. So that became sort of the call and response while preaching. And, even though we have, we're doing hybrid worship, I still have my iPad open and my phone on in the sanctuary, responding to people who are, putting things in the chat during worship. So I think that it has made worship more intimate because more people are talking, more people are sharing their thoughts, expressing themselves. It's easier to do if you're online and you don't have to say or do anything in front of a lot of people. So, and then, just responding while I'm in worship to some of the comments. So I think it has made, in some ways, worship more intimate.
I think that's here to stay. And we from the beginning, I think it's changed our prayers of the people. I don't think this has to do with your question, Jay, but it made me think of it when you talked about the Facebook feed. We have a line where people can text in their prayer requests that we include in the prayers of the people. And what we found when we were totally online, if people missed the service, they'd go back and maybe just go for that because it was a point of connection because people are in their homes and they're not necessarily seeing them. It made our prayer time much more, including many more concerns of the congregation. And now we still do that when we've got people back, and we'll have some outsiders text, but we'll also have people in sanctuary text because they'd rather text than say it out loud. Interesting. But your question, was it harder or easier? I think every week we're faced with the challenge of paying attention to what's happening in the world around us and also looking at the gospel and our ancient texts and seeing how they go together. And, you know, and every week that's different.
Just had two questions that have come forward. One is very close to what we're talking about right now. This is from a person who pastors in a call and response kind of situation, lacking the response. Says he's just leaving. He's leaving reactions up to God, and not feeling like he's going to hear, at least on Sunday, how he's doing. Give some knowing that people have different sized churches, different kinds of technology resources. What has helped in that? One thing that's helping me right now is I've got somebody watching these questions, so I can still be engaged with you. That's something that almost every congregation has. No matter the size, has one extra person who can kind of help watch the social media. And I don't know if this is a time when technology is the great leveler and even small churches can function the way larger churches can. But we have had some questions over the weeks. Well, what about a small church? What have you found that works regardless of whether you have a large team? I think particularly, Emanuel, I think you have the way you were talking about your sanctuary, you probably have a pretty large operation, and Kathy's, yours isn't small. So what have you found while we're on this question? This is kind of pulling back to a little bit more pragmatic kind of challenge, but have you found little things that help?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go
No.
ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it's hard to assess because, you know, I do have a large team working, and so it's always, even, you know, from the start of the pandemic, we had our audio people and our camera people. So we've always had about, you know, 5 to 7 people in the sanctuary while I was preaching, and so it's hard to answer that from a small church perspective. But I think if people are streaming it on Facebook, like I was saying earlier, using the comments as sort of a way to get affirmation, and encouraging people to use the chat in Facebook. I know some smaller churches they're doing worship strictly on Zoom, and that makes it a lot easier because you're able to see faces and see expressions. So it makes it a little more intimate as opposed to just having a camera and then streaming it. Like I said, it's hard for me to answer because we have such a large team.
So, and we've not Zoomed our services. I think one of the challenges of the Zoom format is it has the potential to limit the engagement you have with 8 states and how many countries, right? But I think it does not have to be an enormous investment in technology to stream your service. And there are streaming services. Our whole AV system is still volunteer, although our AV lead, which happens to be my husband, who happens to have taken his training and development in this very seriously, and by most congregations would be a paid staff member. He comes to our weekly staff meetings because our technology has become so robust. But we were streaming before the pandemic in a very accessible way. I think, with one camera, with a soundboard, with a streaming service. And I would encourage small churches to find a volunteer that might have a passion for learning some of these skills as an avocation, building a small AV team, finding the dollars to invest in the equipment. It doesn't have to be with all the bells and whistles to start engaging, and I think in this day and age, it is perhaps next to our websites, it's the best evangelism tool to be out there and be able to share it on Facebook and share it in other, but who comes into a church without having experienced us online before walking through the door? So, and, I'd offer to, if there's somebody, I'm going to offer my husband. I'll offer my husband to, in fact, other churches have called us. How do you get it started on a smaller budget? And I think he'd be glad to just have a brief conversation about how that could happen. I don't think it has to be extraordinary. I do that all the time, offer other people for things.
Once upon a time, I had Dale's cell phone number. I'll be careful not to give it out until you've checked. You mentioned people coming after they found you online. Are you finding people early on? I thought, again, anecdotal, but heard a lot of great stories about people connecting. I didn't hear as many stories about new people finding us. What are you finding now? Or is in this new and changed normal, if that's what we have? You mentioned evangelism. Is it possible to bring people in, knowing that they might only experience part of you? They come to the sanctuary and there's maybe a third of the people that used to have been there. Not,
I think it is, and we're seeing it. We're interestingly, we had some members of the congregation, some who I knew from Ohio, I did have contact with some of these people beforehand. Somebody in London, England, who had been watching for a couple of years before the pandemic hit. And once our online service became the norm, they felt like they could self-identify. They could, like, they told me in different ways, I feel like I've been lurking, like I've been watching, as if not everybody would be welcome, but people have their own perceptions. And now that everybody's online, I feel like I'm more a part of it. So this woman from London, England, joined our church during the pandemic. She's now meeting on Zoom with one of our sacred circles. It's like a women's group, participating in, sometimes she does liturgy. And we've had members, we have one person who used to be a member of the church, lives in Maine. She now watches 4 congregations she follows, and doesn't miss a sermon from any of the 4 services each week. And I wonder how many people are out there like that. Probably not many watch 4 services, but it does call into question, what are the relationships with congregations, right? You can it's now a la carte. You could go to a Bible study online in Kansas and come to worship in Arlington, Virginia, all from Ohio.
Yeah, I think a lot of evangelism takes place online. We do Google and Facebook ads. Your website becomes extremely important. in terms of reaching new people, although our website needs to be updated. But yeah, we're just doing a lot of things online to reach people, staying active on social media. I think, if I were starting a church today, probably the first hire I would have is a social media expert who knows how to use all of the social media platforms to reach new people. I mean, because there is an art and science to it, of how to do it. We in the beginning, we were just putting stuff on social media, and not much response, but talking with people who actually do that for a living, who know about it, really changed everything around. So yes, we've had people join the church, who are not in the Kansas City, Missouri area. Like I said, 42 different states of people watching, and a lot of that is simply because of our social media presence, as well as we invested money in Google ads, and I know not everyone could possibly do that, but I would say evangelism and social media go hand in hand. Jesus sent the 70 out to go to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
I have a question here that says, coming out of the latest pandemic surge, how do we attract more people to engage or re-engage with in-person or online worship? And I wonder if implied in that is perhaps in the latest surge, it was harder. We had, I'll just share on campus and within our school community, we had such tremendous response. Everybody came together, students, faculty, staff, people who supported us. Didn't feel like we had there was just no reticence to jump in. There was no, not a lot of pushback. I wonder if we had to do this again, if we would be so fortunate. Is there a shelf life to patience around some of these things? If I think I hear implied in this question that maybe when we had to, during the Delta and then the Omicron, when we had to tighten again, sounds like maybe even fewer people came back. Will we have the ability to do this again? Was this a one-time? Congregations have this kind of commitment? Has this made us more resilient, or have we used up the grace we have for one another? That's not a good theological statement or question, but
The question was, how do we re-engage people though, right?
yes, but I think implied was it was harder the last time than it was before, because it was really about the last coming out of the last surge.
I think, as I was saying, before this started, I don't think in many congregations people are going to go back into the sanctuary like they did prior to COVID. So for us, a lot of the focus has been on online. How do we keep people connected online? And part of that, just going old school, we have a group called our Congregational care leaders, and their job is to contact all of the people under or in their group. And so it's something that we did a few times during the pandemic, to have our congregational care leaders contact all of the people that they were responsible for, asking, what do you need from the church? How can we help? How can we keep you engaged? Just asking the people those questions. And so that was extremely helpful. We learned that we had to make some adjustments because, you know, the focus is no longer bringing people into the building. And in some ways, I think God is using this time to say, hey, you all were spending too much time in the building to begin with. Your buildings became almost the sacred cow. And, you know, I use this time to tell people, you know, in the Bible, when they talked about church, they weren't talking about a building. There's no connection with building. And so maybe God is using us during this time to say, hey, move, you know, you could reach more people if you didn't focus so much on the building. And with the internet, you know, it's the possibilities are endless. So I think for the members that were already connected with St. James, we called, we stayed connected with them over and over again. For in terms of reaching new people, as I said earlier, it was a lot of social media.
That was a prescient response, Emanuel. Just before you started talking, we had a question come through. Will our buildings become obsolete?
Well, I would say yes, but the sad thing for St. James is we're in a $1.8 million debt reduction campaign for a building that people don't come to.
Oh,
I think the movement will be a lot of the small groups that we might be like in the house church days, and where people might gather from time to time in a large setting, but most people will be fed spiritually in small groups.
well,
That's
but
just my
Emanuel,
prediction.
I heard you talking about all the great ways your building is being used,
Right.
which really is the church, right? And I think that is going to be, I think it's going to continue to be super important. Like during the pandemic, our food assistance center in Arlington was so bombarded with the number of people they were having to help that they were going to eliminate fresh produce from what they distributed. And long story, but we picked up produce packing from all the area gardens and, you know, during the pandemic so that it could meet that need. And that's just, you know, you mentioned 5 other things that you're doing, but I think we need to be more creative about how our building resources can be used in service of others. And I think there's still a huge desire, not only for opportunities and ways to facilitate being the hands and feet of Christ or coming together as community, that the building can have purpose for that. So I don't know that buildings are going to be obsolete. I think worship is never going to be the same.
Yeah, I guess I should have said repurposing the building is what I'm hearing a lot of, repurposing what we did use the building for new things, partnering with nonprofit organizations and renting out space and all of those things.
And bearing witness. I mean, I think one of the challenges, yes, you can bear witness on social media about the things that you're doing as a congregation, but there is something about being a living witness in the community of values that are steeped in compassion and justice. And I want to jump back to Jay's question about impatience with the pandemic. And one of the things I've noticed, I think initially the change was happening so fast and was so necessary that everybody in every direction was just glad we were doing something and supportive of whatever decision we were making. And mind you, we're a congregational church. So normally we have listening sessions and then congregational meetings, and it takes a painstakingly long process to make any decision. And we were making them right and left. Now, as people are coming back, the change has slowed down. It's become more incremental, but there's less patience with it. And I think part of that is being back in the physical space, and so being more invested in what I would consider content, rather than process or what really has meaning. That might be try to put a graceful spin on it, but that's hard to wrestle with when you've made quantum big huge changes and everybody's been good, and now you're tweaking things as you go along and it's causing an uproar. So, and to see how people respond to that is, it's not just the person and the staff, it has a ripple effect through the whole community, right? When it's what are the conversations we're having? Are we having conversations about meaning and the vision of the future, and why we're here, or some more tactical, less consequential topic?
You've just named the tension, and I think a lot of pastors are living in right now. We moved quickly from talking about the intersection of purpose and place to whether people are patient, and then some of the challenges that you just named. And I think the pressure is on pastors. I'm inspired by what both of you are saying about finding that sense of purpose, that it's not just about the building. We probably all, as kids, heard the little, the church is not a steeple, and the little fingers that meant the people. We learned that, but we're probably relearning some of that. Before we even got on that topic, we have another, there's some nice coincidences or serendipities here. I had a question come up just a short while ago. Soteriology, that's the first time in 4 weeks that we've had a soteriological question. My moniker for this question, but here's the question. Since salvation is about God's intention to bless the world, how are you preaching salvation in this unique time?
Wow.
Who wants to take a stab at that?
For 2021, our preaching theme was the promise of restoration because of everything that happened in 20. And we lost a lot of people, and of course there was the shutdown and everything changed. So in 21, we decided that our teaching and preaching focus would just be on all the ways in which God restores us, including how we are rescued from the power of sin. And we focused on that in Bible study, looking at various stories of restoration. It's amazing once you, if you're looking for it, just how many times or how many instances the Bible talks about restoration, people being restored, the people being restored. So that became a heavy emphasis for us, because we wanted to encourage people, and we wanted to show people that there's still hope. And we actually got a lot of response. Actually, when I announced that this would be our teaching theme for the entire year, I got a letter from a guy in Florida who's never even been to Kansas City, who watches us, sending me some resources, and saying, I heard you talk about restoration. So I just wanted to share a few articles, a few books that might help you. So it seemed like people really caught on, and it's something that people really needed to hear, just that, regardless of what's going on, there is hope.
When I talk about salvation, I often will talk about, Jesus talked about the kingdom of God is among us. It's right here. And we can experience salvation in the here and now by a lot of the choices that we're making about following in the way of Jesus and living a life of that is promoting healing and joy and justice. Leave it at that.
Yeah. We have a question that's going to take us in a direction we haven't gone in the last 4 weeks. We've talked about preaching in a pandemic, through a pandemic, despite a pandemic. This question is about, did we preach about COVID in this polarized world? I'm wondering too, how's it been to preach when there's such antagonism around so much of our common life. So here's the question: are you preaching, or did you preach about the vaccine?
Absolutely.
Yes, I did. I said this is not the first vaccine that we've had. We are a people of vaccine. The blood of Jesus was the first vaccine that eliminated the COVID sin. So yeah, I absolutely preached about the vaccine.
Yeah, I know I'm in many ways, I wish that I had a more diverse, a more politically diverse congregation. And I think it's sad that COVID became a political issue for many. I mean, I think that's probably some of the tension in some of the congregations, but it's pretty easy for me to speak about COVID and vaccines in our congregation that is all about it. But I've also talked about the polarization that we're facing, and how do we live out the command to love our neighbors, whoever they are, even if we have very different opinions between them. And I think, I mean, what I'm hearing in that question is some of that, right? How do we handle the polarization of the country? And I find, again, naming it, and for me, at the end of the day, as with 90% of my preaching, it ends up falling back on the call for agape love, even as we work through disagreement. So,
Yeah, I think, when I talked about the vaccine, I would, try to steer through the political division. I'd say don't listen to any politician when it talks about medical things. I'm not going to ask my veterinarian about my foot. I'm not going to ask a politician to cut my hair. So I said it. Don't listen to any politician. What does the medical community say? Listen to them.
Yeah.
And let's block out what Democrats or Republicans say.
Thank you. That's a good perspective to end that one on. Maybe we'll come back to it, but got some questions that are coming up, very specific kinds of things. I'll start with one a little bit general, but someone who's just had a question about how have you done specifically education, adult education is a question here, but we've talked a lot about preaching and worship, and that's what the Schooler Institute is about. But has formal education languished, or is it gotten stronger?
For us, go ahead, I'm sorry. I don't want to always be first.
No, go right ahead.
No.
We keep going. We're on Zoom,
Yes.
know, it's,
So
but
you're doing classes for kids too on Zoom?
we we were doing things for kids on Zoom at the beginning, and we were doing, some really creative music and yoga and stories, and then we found that it just was, and we went from a specific time when those were on Zoom to then developing resources that they could access on YouTube on demand. And then we've migrated for children to a resource letter every week that includes books that relate to the themes of worship, a blessing that you can offer, some tactile exercises, ways to talk about difficult things. Every week, our director of faith formation sends out, it's an email, but it's a really robust resource list, which has had a great response, but that's very different from our early days of Zoom and then YouTube.
Question just came in a few minutes ago. Do you show children's faces on live stream or Zoom?
No, we don't.
We
So
have
children's moments you pan away from.
we have the backs of their heads, so you'll see, but we really work to not have young faces on screen unless they're having a leadership role in the service, and we really try to incorporate children and youth as leaders in different services. We also have each family sign a media statement at the beginning of each year, whether they're willing to have, so we do post pictures on Facebook, social media, etc., but we have permission, a blanket permission for the year. Or not, there are some people, but and when we post pictures, we never include names of children and youth.
Yeah, we're the same. We may post it on social media, but we actually don't have a children's message in worship. The kids actually leave, and they have children's church. Our adult education grew over the pandemic and has remained strong, but we found with our children and teens, they were all Zoomed out. So we started out with Zoom, but then like Kathy said, we would send out something each week, activity packets for the kids. And then when the weather was warm, we had activities outside.
I have a question about offering. Again, a worship question. Both of you mentioned that giving has remained pretty good. In at least one church here in Columbus this last week, it wasn't quite as good as it could have been. Not that my gift was going to balance the budget, but during the offertory, all the sounds and sights were the same as they've always been. So I automatically took my checkbook out, started writing a check. And then it was announced that we weren't going to pass the plates, which I knew that was, that's all changed. But that there was a plate in the back of the sanctuary. I'm sure there was, but the check was still in my pocket when I got home. Again, it probably didn't affect the total giving that much. But what is it? There's always been, I remember robust debates in worship planning over where the offertory should be. Should it be before the sermon so that the preacher can actually control the end of the service time and get us out on time? Should it be after as a response in faith to the preached word, or maybe not after, because it sounds like then the preacher is just trying to get people ready to give more? I've heard a lot of different perspectives on that, but honestly, I think all of us have had some sense of that. That is a part of the liturgical pattern, our response to God's grace in our life. worship is largely about ritualizing things we believe and symbolizing things we want to be about. The fact that we don't socially interact as much, has that hollowed that out a little bit? Even if we're getting the money, are our people getting that part of the liturgical meaning?
That's an interesting way to phrase the question. Prior to the pandemic, we would have weeks we pass all the plates and there may be $1 or $2 in the plates because more than 70% of our membership gives by automatic withdrawal, which is a key to our financial health. I mean, it's because it is even throughout the year. And so we, before the pandemic, were struggling with what to do with this ritual because it felt so funny to be passing plates with nothing in them. So we are glad to have the plates at the door. And I think generosity is kind of part of Rock Springs DNA. And we invite, to give online or at the door as you leave, but that part of the service is out for us.
Yeah, we eliminated it as well because even prior to the pandemic, most of our giving was online. But we did pass the plate, but we stopped that. Now that we're back in the sanctuary, it's people can give as they leave in the back. I don't think it has too much impact because, like I said, most people are doing text to give or online or automatic withdrawal. We do still do some ritual around the offering. When it's that time, we have the scripture and we have the prayer and encourage people to give, and then a song that we always do during the offering, even though the plate's not being passed, but you can see people on their phones texting to give. Well, at least I think they're texting to give. They might be trying to find a restaurant.
There are a lot of QR codes in bulletins, to the extent we have bulletins anymore.
We don't have bulletins anymore.
But I suppose you could mix that QR code up with the menu for wherever you're going after.
True. That's true.
Again, Emanuel, people are probably wondering when your sermon's going to be over.
Yeah, that's why we don't put it after the offering, because if it was dependent upon my sermon, we might not get anything.
Have one more question that has come in. Please explain or provide an example of the parental agreement document you spoke about. We might say, I don't know if that's something you can put in the chat, or we can find a way to distribute it to the list of people who participated today. But we have a very specific.
I'd be glad to. I don't have it handy, but I'm glad to send it to you and you can distribute it.
You can Google some generic ones online. They're not that hard to find.
Well, we have just a few minutes. Either of you have anything that we haven't covered? What would you want people to know about where you're at in your ministry, where you're going?
I guess, just emphasize learning how to preach and do ministry in a hybrid manner, because it's not going away. It's how things are going. I would, we're actually bringing in a consultant to restructure our entire organization, our staff, our ministries, just because we want to be ready for this new era of church. And I would encourage all pastors, church leaders to really look at structuring. You can only go as far as your structure allows it. And an organization doesn't do what it wants to do, it does what it's structured to do. And because things have changed so much, I would just encourage, really look at how you structure your ministries, structure your staff if you have it, your paid and unpaid staff, so that you are positioned to do ministry in this completely new era of ministry.
You asked, were you finished?
Yes.
Okay, didn't want to cut you off. A while ago, Jay, you asked how we were doing, and right now I'm doing pretty well, but back in January, I felt a lot of disequilibrium and uncertainty coming, when we shut down again we shut down right before Christmas Eve because of Omicron. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there were conversations about how will we mark the end of COVID and the pandemic, and speculation about that. Initially, there are conversations about a celebration where you can't have a big celebration when you've lost all these lives. And I had this aha moment that may be obvious to many, but I don't think there's going to be a marker of the end. That there's this ebb and flow, and who knows the kind of transition we'll be in for some time. But I think at some point in the future, we may look back and say, oh, we've come through this passage of time. And so the shift for me has been not on what is going to be the end point, but how are we going to embrace the future? And so for us, right after Easter, we're starting a new visioning process of what the church is becoming. And that has felt energy, once I got my head around that, around creating a process that helps us lean into what church is for us, which we know now is not a building, but what is it? And how do we want to be embodying it going forward? It's just energized me in a new way, rather than focusing on where are we with this COVID mess. I think we're going to keep ebbing and flowing with that and look back someday and make meaning out of it, maybe. But looking forward and realizing, I think one of our primary tasks, or at least vocationally for me, is how do we manage this constant change and still be, and how do we keep reshaping what hope looks like and what joy looks like in this time.
Well, you both graduated from MTSO in the late 90s, and I imagine preach and pastor much differently than you did when you first left the school. But it sounds like after these last 2 years, even more transformation. It's encouraging. Back to my question, how are you doing? I like the honesty. You'd love to have a sabbatical. I hope you get it. I hope you find that space and that peace to renew. But I'm also hearing alongside that a deep sense of purpose. And I hope and pray that for the two of you and all of you have joined us in these last weeks. Been a challenging time, no doubt. Things are different, but there are stories to be told and heard that are good. And there's reason to believe, while it won't be the same, there's important work to do. And it's been good to be together these 4 weeks, talk a little bit about it, continue to share your reflections. Thanks everybody jumping in the chat. I think you know my email address or can find it on the MTSO website. If you have thoughts or ideas about future experiences or events like this, we are very interested in hearing it. For now, go in peace, friends.